Counter-Narrative News, bringing you a review and a reflection and a retrospective on one of the most important theoreticians and activists as it pertains to black liberation, working class global struggle, particularly in the global south, particularly in the Caribbean and in Africa, but wider as well into Asia. That's Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney was born in 1942 in Georgetown, Guyana. By 1966, he does a PhD at the School of Oriental Asian Studies in London on the slave trade on the Upper Guinea coast. This, along with the Oxford University published piece in 1970, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast from 1545 to 1800, a work by Walter Rodney, goes to inform largely his signature work, which is a fantastic book published in 1972 called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, an absolutely leading work on the history of relationship between African peoples and civilizations and European colonization. From 1966 to 1967, and then again from 1969 to 1974, Walter Rodney has an important position at the Dar es Salaam University in socialist Tanzania. Tanzania at this time is led by a quote-unquote African socialist with the Ujima revolutionary theory of Tanzania, that's Julius Nyerere. However, Walter Rodney gravitates more closely to Abdur Rahman Babu, who has an ideological and political fight with Nyerere around the discussions and the differences of building socialism in Africa and fighting colonialism. By October 15, 1968, the government of Jamaica dubs Walter Rodney a persona non grata, leading then to the October 16, 1968 riots, dubbed the Walter Rodney riots, which resulted in some half a dozen deaths and millions of pounds of damage. This is indicative of the influence of Walter Rodney's revolutionary theories on the one hand, and also the way in which he was able to fuse the revolutionary socialist ideas that he was espousing and the Pan-Africanist ideas in that, together with the revolutionary working class grassroots, including with the increasingly radicalized Rastafari political community in Jamaica, leading to his 1969 publication and informing his publication called Groundings with My Brothers, which is a very important read as well. By 1974, he returns to Guyana and basically is barred from taking up his position at the university back in Georgetown there, under influence of the leading colonial powers, not least Washington. And on 13th of June 1980, at the age of 38, Walter Rodney is killed in a car by a car bomb. He is, like I said, a very important leading figure that must be studied to have a grounding, as it were, and understanding of the history of African people and the diaspora, and also, very interestingly, the way in which Walter Rodney very positively and in a very principled way navigates and leads the leadership of uniting colonized people, particularly African heritage people and Indian heritage people in the context of Guyana, but also across the Caribbean and Africa, and as a global project, very principled in this kind of African and Asian alliance there. Right now, just really wanted to share some aspects and quotes from a book called Walter Rodney Speaks. And this section, which we'd like to share, is called The British Left. So this is Walter Rodney's comments on the British left. He says here, and this is a direct quote from the passage on page 30 of this book: "There was no possibility for Marxist development within the old left. There were still old Communist Party types and the old Trotskyite types. There were also one or two young Trotskyites from the colonies. Together they called themselves the Trotskyite movement. From then and until now, I've always found it difficult to understand what Trotskyism is, because I couldn't really get anything out of these people's positions." It tended to be inarticulate, it tended to be whimsical, it tended to be downright foolish on many questions, and this was not my understanding of Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution, but nevertheless I didn't press that issue. All I knew was that I didn't want to be in some of these movements that were called Marxist. Neither the Communist Party, which was old and effete with an average age, it seemed to me, of about 60 or 65, with most everybody there past working age, nor the Trotskyites, who were something else again, the result of a period of sectarianism that had gone on for decades. One would come across Trotskyite factions within which I had found majority and minority elements, and then I heard about factions. And one would go to conferences and you would find that there was a faction comprising two people. They had been struggling and defending the truth for 30 years, since the 1930s, and of course, if one of them died, that would leave only one person to guard the whole destiny of the human race by concentrating on his particular version of what was accurate. And often, as I said, it was just foolish. From any perspective, it didn't make any sense. It certainly was not about the struggle against capitalism. Very seldom did I hear these people talk about how they expected, if at all, to mobilize workers or to deal with migrants and so on. Besides, they were racist, and that's another trip. On the other hand, whenever they had a program, when finally you heard that one of these so-called Trotskyists had a program, you heard that he was running for parliament. It was a tremendous letdown after all the struggle for the truth to hear that the only way to struggle for the truth was to run for the British Parliament and to lose their electoral deposit, of course, because nobody would take them seriously. There was supposedly a New Left, literally the people around the Journal of the New Left Review, and to some extent around the London School of Economics. And from my brief meetings with some of them and my readings of their materials, my impression was that they tended to be very facile with the tradition of attempting to be clever. The idea was who could put forth clever formulations. I was never convinced of any depth or of any seriousness of the purpose among these people. In fact, I found a couple of them that I met to be upsetting, even in the kinds of relationship one had with them. And there was always that latent racism. Sometimes coming out in paternalism, something coming out in hostile manifestations. End of quote. Well, one could sum up all of that by saying, shit don't change, i.e. it's the same situation today. Central to what Rodney is saying here is that the internalization of racism on the British left across the different factions and colorations and shades of the communists and Marxists and Trotskyists. I mean, it's across the board there, the racism there, the lack of grassroots and mass work, as he says. They never talked about how to mobilize workers or to deal with migrants, he says, which is still a continuing and very much with the collapse of the left around Brexit, and many of them ending up supporting the great anti-migrant white supremacist far-right project that is Brexit, is very much a reality today. Of course, on the same timeline, there was a developing perhaps black Marxist or Pan-Africanist Marxist tradition here, or the black radical tradition, perhaps one can call it, of people like the New Beacon Bookshop and the New Beacon Press, the Bogle Overture publishers, who are the same group, the Jessica Eric Huntley, who set up the Walter Rodney Bookshop, which closed in 1990 in West Ealing. Actually, Jessica and Eric Huntley of the Walter Rodney Bookshop and Bogle Overture books published Walter Rodney himself. So there was a African and Asian radical anti-colonial socialist, even Marxist tradition in this country, which was very much counter-distinguished and in many ways counter-distinctive and oppositional to how Rodney describes the British left here. However, into the mid and late 80s and into the 90s, this all collapses and is not able to rejuvenate itself in accordance with the changing balance of forces weighed against the global revolutionary forces, which has its impact today. The challenges remain to lean upon this tradition of the theoretical and practical work of people like Shivanandan, the Asian youth movements, Walter Rodney, John LaRose, New Beacon. We still have, some of these veterans still alive today in the form of Professor Gus John, Comrade Hurley in Brixton, Eric Huntley is still alive, and there's many others. We still can take these people forward. We can take their legacies forward and try to rejuvenate something in the line of what they were doing, very much working primarily with migrants, following from Walter Rodney's critique, being present in serve the people mass working communities and developing the type of revolutionary theoretical outlook that people like Walter Rodney really blazed a trail for. Many thanks for listening. Please do continue to support us and supporting our work by especially encouraging people to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to like, share and comment, as we are the only daily news and analysis service through the lens and loyalty to the anti-colonial, black liberation and global working class struggle. Thank you.